I'm Peter Adamson, and you're listening to the History of Philosophy podcast, brought to you with the support of the Philosophy Department at King's College London and the LMU in Munich. Online at historyofphilosophy.net. Today's episode, Pure and Simple, Quietism. French writers living under Louis XIV seem to have had quite a bleak view of human nature. They saw hypocrisy as not merely widespread, but inevitable. We are creatures driven by relentless self-interest who nonetheless want to be seen as altruistic and generous. Self-love is part of being human, but it's also all too human to want to conceal this selfishness from others and even from oneself. As we've seen, their grim assessment of the human condition had a powerful religious background. Most of the figures we've been discussing were somehow connected to Jansenism, which insisted on the wickedness of humans so as to demonstrate the need for divine grace. Yet the thinkers of this time who most emphatically insisted that self-love can be eliminated were also driven by faith. They were the Quietists, radical optimists who believed in the possibility of a pure love for others and, in particular, for God. But there was a catch. In Quietism, eliminating self-love meant abandoning the self entirely, along with anything it might want. One should even be prepared to give up on happiness itself. With optimism this bleak, who needs pessimism? In a sense, Quietism was nothing new. The medieval period featured numerous authors, usually classified as mystics, who spoke of abandonment of the self, the annihilation of one's own will to make room for the will of God. Marguerite Porete would be a fine example. You may remember that she too was French, and that in the early 14th century, her deeply pious attitude was rewarded with execution at the hands of the Parisian authorities. Almost 400 years later, these authorities had a chance to prove that they had grown more broad-minded and tolerant, and they failed spectacularly. In the late 17th century, another pious woman thinker was examined by the church on suspicion of heresy, though she was only imprisoned and not actually put to death. Her name was Jeanne Guyon, though you'll often see her called simply Madame Guyon. She and her allies were certainly not called Quietists because of any reluctance to make their views known. To the contrary, Guyon's first work was called Spiritual Torrents, and a modern-day scholar has commented that this title serves only too well to describe her style. Rather, the term refers to their emphasis on silent, contemplative prayer and on inner stillness. On this point, Guyon might remind us of another female mystic whom we covered more recently, Teresa of Avila, who was an avid practitioner of silent prayer designed to quiet the inner feelings of the soul, and who was likewise accused of heresy. Is it me, or is there a pattern developing here? This comparison is especially apt because Guyon was strongly influenced by John of the Cross, another Spanish mystic who followed Teresa and disseminated her mystical teachings. Completing the parallel, Guyon was likewise paired with a male author who promoted and defended her ideas. This was François Fénelon, a multifaceted author whose contributions ranged over political philosophy, education, and moralizing literature, as well as Quietism and the theory of pure love. I'm going to concentrate on these two figures in the following, but it should be noted that there were other so-called Quietists in the 17th century whose ideas are comparable to those of Guyon and Fénelon. For example, François de Sales, François Malaval, and for a change of pace, someone whose name wasn't François, the Flemish ascetic and visionary Antoinette Bourguignon. She once distilled the essence of Quietism into a few sentences, writing, "Resignation consists in a cessation from all things, that we may receive God only. There needs no more than to cease and to receive, for all our cares and vexations or activities for things of this life are hindrances which stifle the operations which God would cause in our soul. We must be quiet and rest, that we may suffer the Holy Spirit to act alone." Unfortunately, Jeanne Guyon wasn't given much chance to be quiet and rest. As we know from her autobiography, she suffered through an unhappy marriage but escaped it thanks to her husband's death, which also left her financially well off. She had spiritual relationships with several male counselors, something that attracted nasty rumors and innuendo. Here was a wealthy widow being courted by religious divines, exactly the situation satirized by Molière in Tartuffe. She maintained good relations with the French crown for a time, teaching at a school founded by the king's wife, Madame de Maintenon. At this time, in the late 1680s, she also began her exchange of ideas with Fénelon. He became one of the few who was willing to defend Guyon, as her writings increasingly brought her under suspicion. Fénelon was a bishop, but not really in a position to keep her safe. In fact, he was, along with her, subjected to strenuous and politically damaging critique from another bishop, Jacques Bossuet. In 1695, Guyon was arrested and jailed. Adding insult to injury, Fénelon dropped his support of her, admitting that he had been deceived by her and that she was in fact a hypocrite. This concession was made under significant pressure, since Fénelon was also being investigated by the Church. Eventually, in 1699, the papacy decided that his writing was not actually heretical, though it was apt to lead others into error. Then Guyon was released in 1703, and the two resumed their correspondence, staying in touch until Fénelon died in 1715. Guyon died 2 years later. Alongside their theological views, something else the two shared was an interest in education. Fénelon helped write the constitution for the school founded by Madame de Maintenon, where Guyon taught while she was still in favor, and he also wrote a work called On the Education of Girls. Given his alliance with Guyon, we might expect this to be a clarion call for turning young women into religious thinkers and even philosophers. But that expectation is not fulfilled. Instead, Fénelon's main point here is that girls should be offered training in useful and practical arts, those needed to run a household or estate. So not just handiwork, but also keeping accounts, for instance. The higher arts of humanist learning have no place in their education. Here, he was in agreement with Madame de Maintenon. The school she founded was no philosophical academy or place for the highest nobility. The students were girls of the lower elite who were being formed into effective members of the bourgeoisie. Maintenon thus mocked girls who refused to do housework and could only enjoy the company of rhetoricians, philosophers, and poets. Fénelon was similarly dismissive of useless learning. The more abstract arts, he thought, were better suited to boys, and meanwhile he had nothing but scorn for the flirtation and aristocratic social etiquette that passed for femininity at the French court. All this fits with Fénelon's ideas about wealth and class more generally. He deplored indulgence in luxury, and wrote an astoundingly frank letter criticizing Louis XIV for launching expensive foreign wars. We know the letter is his because it survives in Fénelon's handwriting, though it's not clear whether he actually sent it to the king. Maybe it's the equivalent of an email written in anger and then left in the drafts folder. The pastoral and educational concerns of Guyon and Fénelon also make themselves felt in their Quietist writings. This is especially true of Guyon, who was keen to emphasize the feasibility and simplicity of spiritual conversion. The title of one work says it all: a short and easy method of prayer, which all can practice very easily and through which all can arrive in a short time to a high perfection. She knew that believers would be more motivated to follow her guidelines if they did not seem too challenging. Showing off her flair for metaphor, Guyon says that working towards spiritual perfection is like launching a ship, hard to get going as you shove it away from shore, but smooth sailing thereafter. As long as we're drawing modern parallels, she's a bit like the modern diet advisor who promises that you can lose 20 pounds in 20 days if you just get off the sofa. But this isn't only a marketing strategy. For one thing, Guyon is speaking from her own experience. She says in her autobiography that she found contemplative prayer easy. The hours seemed only like minutes to me, and I was unable not to do it. Love would not let me have an instant of rest. For another thing, Guyon is genuinely convinced that anyone can set their selfish motives aside and discover their love for God, an inclusive approach that she justifies by referring to the powerful attraction exerted on all of us by God. She claims that simple folk can respond to that call more easily than the educated because, by not relying on reason, they are not misguided by their own selves. In keeping with this theme of accessibility, Guyon does not demand asceticism of her readers, and is critical of other religious authors who focus on such external actions rather than on inner reorientation. As she puts it, all that is necessary is to stay attentive to God, and everything happens perfectly. Not everyone is capable of outward austerity, but everyone is capable of this. That idea of remaining calmly attentive is what puts the quiet in Quietism. Guyon's preferred spiritual method is all about passivity and stillness, the aim being to eliminate any motivations that belong to oneself and not to God. Thus, she instructs, lose all of your own will unceasingly in the will of God, and renounce all specific inclinations, however good they might appear. As soon as you feel them begin, make yourself indifferent, and only desire what God has desired from the beginning of time. One might say that this quietness is a version of negative theology, but in the practical sphere. Conversion means eliminating all will and human activity, not because the self has become nothing at all, but because it has achieved union with a God who transcends all such concerns. As she puts it in another nice turn of phrase, two different kinds of people are quiet, the one from having nothing to say, the other from having too much to say. It is the same here. We keep quiet because of excess, not lack. Guyon is at pains to correct a possible misconception here, namely that the converted person will become entirely inactive. Rather, the person will perform only pure actions, these being actions that stem from God's will rather than one's own. We need, she says, to remain at peace and to move only when He moves us. At first glance, it's hard to see why anyone would get upset about this, never mind accuse Guyon of heresy and throw her in the Bastille. But this would be to forget the interest of the Church in serving as the intermediary between the believer and God, offering salvation to the sinful through the sacraments. Guyon doesn't seem much interested in any of that. She encourages her readers to let God worry about their sins rather than obsessing over them. Dwelling on one's shortcomings is often more damaging than the shortcomings themselves. Critics of Quietism worried that this would encourage an anything-goes approach. Once I've achieved inner unity with God, it doesn't matter what I do or don't do out in the world, whether it's going to church or having affairs with priests, as Guyon was salaciously accused of doing. Even the apostle of tolerance Pierre Bayle said the Quietists were unforgivable because of their tacit acceptance of moral debauchery. It's ironic that the Quietists were accused of being hypocrites in this way, because their philosophy can, as I say, be understood as a forthright rejection of the idea that hypocrisy is inevitable. Self-love can be defeated and replaced with a pure love that has nothing to do with one's own interests, and in fact could even be maintained if it were against one's own interests. This case is made in a short work by Fénelon called simply On Pure Love. Of course, the kind of love he's really interested in is pure and disinterested love for God. But to render the idea more plausible, he points out that people are sometimes willing to die for their friends or their country. We find such heroes even amongst the ancient Greeks and Romans. La Rochefoucauld considered such cases too, but argued that even such apparently selfless acts of sacrifice were in fact motivated by self-love. These pagan martyrs just wanted to secure their good reputation for posterity. In the end, Fénelon rather undermines his own argument by admitting that in non-Christian antiquity, love for others was indeed always a manifestation of self-love. And in describing the insidious power of self-love, he nearly quotes La Rochefoucauld's most famous maxim about hypocrisy being a tribute that vice pays to virtue. Here's Fénelon's version of the sentiment. Self-love renders homage to disinterested virtue by the subtleties with which it wants to take on its appearance. Still, Fénelon thinks that noble friendship can provide a partial model and inspiration for the pure love of the Christian spiritual adept. Insofar as such adepts retain any love for themselves at all, it is because they have aligned their will with God's. And after all, God does love them. So in this sense, they do love themselves, but in the same way they love strangers. To reinforce the point that love of God should not be a manifestation of self-love, Fénelon engages in a thought experiment. What if loving God were completely detached from any good consequences? To avoid the lingering suspicion that we're only loving God in hopes of meriting eternal salvation, Fénelon considers what he calls a wholly hypothetical scenario, in which we know that God will destroy our souls along with our bodies. We would thus have nothing to hope for and nothing to fear from any prospective afterlife. Nonetheless, we should still love God and love Him just as much, because we love Him for His perfection and not for any advantages we might get out of it. Here, Fénelon is echoing one of the other Quietists named François. This was François de Sales, a significantly earlier spiritual author, he died in 1622, who said that love of God could and should survive even learning that one is guaranteed to go to hell. If I must be among the damned, he wrote, grant me at least not to be among those who curse your holy name. Not content to leave it at that, he added that if God were to have even a slight preference for my being damned over my being saved, I too should prefer to be damned. In a calmer age, the thought experiments of de Sales and Fénelon might have been written off as harmless hyperbole. But this was the 17th century, so of course an enormous and bitter controversy ensued, with none other than Nicolas Malebranche taking a significant part. The debate is of significant philosophical interest, and not only because Malebranche was involved. The core question was how human motivation works, and whether it is really possible to eliminate or ignore self-interest entirely. That implacable opponent of the Quietists, Jacques Bossuet, considered the matter from a theological angle. He protested that Fénelon was effectively questioning the whole basis of Christianity. The pure love that he constructs has atrocious consequences, since it leads to indifference about salvation. Malebranche had a more philosophical complaint. He was drawn into the controversy in 1697 when yet another François Lamy, published a work called On Self-Knowledge, which agreed with the Quietist position and cited Malebranche as a potential ally. This was not implausible since, as you may recall, Malebranche's ethics revolved around the idea of choosing God over created goods. But Malebranche was furious at being lumped in with the Quietists, and wrote against Lamy. Further exchanges were lobbed back and forth, ending with a final salvo from Malebranche in 1700. For Malebranche, the problem with the Quietist thought experiment was twofold. First, he thought it was pointless to entertain such counterfactual situations, insisting that God wills to be loved as he is, not as it is impossible for him to be. Second, he thought that we can never want anything outside of our own happiness. To this extent, self-love really is an ineliminable aspect of human nature, and it was God who created that nature. So, as he sardonically remarked, "Don't ask me why I want to be happy, ask the one who made me." For Malebranche, happiness is bound up with pleasure, so we are only ever motivated by the desire for pleasure and for the avoidance of pain. From this perspective, too, the promise of a blessed and rapturous afterlife is a vital part of the correct relationship towards God. To this, Lamy made the obvious rejoinder that Malebranche was making love for God a mere expression of self-love. Fénelon added a more nuanced criticism. On Malebranche's view, he argued, we would have no free will, because we would inevitably choose whatever seems to us most pleasant. And of course, people do often choose on the basis of pleasure, precisely because we are driven by self-love, but we don't have to do so. Rather, it is possible to love purely, which means indifferently or without any concern for oneself. His thought experiment, impossible and hypothetical though it is well designed to bring out both the possibility and rightness of such a love, which Guyon praised in a letter to Fénelon. I beg of you to embrace a disinterested love in order to reciprocate God's gratuitous love. The debate was deeply theological. It raised issues about the sacramental functions of the Church as an intercessor between God and humankind, but it was also deeply philosophical. At stake was nothing less than the nature of human motivation itself and the question of whether all our choices are ultimately rooted in self-interest. It's a plausible, though disquieting, suggestion. I say this while also acknowledging that the Quietists might have rejected the label of philosophers. We've seen that Guyon in particular was dismissive about the power of reason to bring us to God. Then again, some figures of this period were just as pessimistic about the power of reason, and yet must certainly be classified as philosophers. On the threshold of the 17th century, we had skeptics like Montaigne and Charron testing the pretensions of human rationality. And 100 years on from them, another healthy dose of skepticism would be administered by Pierre Bayle, author of a famous dictionary that helped to create a whole new genre, the philosophical reference work. My name isn't François, but I'll still be frank and say that I hope you'll join me for an entry into Bayle and his dictionary here on The History of Philosophy, without any gaps.